The city has fallen. The gates are broken. The last defender is dead in the street. This is the moment history books describe as victory. Flags raised, generals celebrated, the empire expanded by another dot on the map. Coins will be minted, monuments will be carved, poets will write about the glory of Roman arms and the unstoppable march of civilization. But in the streets below, the celebrating generals, something else is happening. Something that will not appear on the coins. Something that will not be carved into the monuments. Something that the official records will describe with a single bureaucratic phrase. The city was given over to the soldiers, and then move on. That phrase, given over to the soldiers, 3 words that survivors of a dozen conquered cities understood with absolute physical clarity. 3 words that meant the gates were open, the laws were suspended, and the women of the city were no longer protected by anything except the random mercy of individual men who had been trained since adolescence to show none. What happened in those hours, sometimes days, between the fall of the walls and the restoration of military order is one of the most consistently documented and consistently ignored chapters in Roman history. The sources are not vague. They are not speculative. Roman writers, Greek writers, Jewish writers, North African writers, men from every corner of the empire who witnessed these events or recorded accounts from those who did, described what happened with a specificity that leaves no room for comfortable interpretation. We are going to look at that specificity directly, not because it is easy, because it is true, and because the women it happened to deserve to have their reality acknowledged, rather than buried under the word victory. Drop your city and country in the comments right now, and if you are not subscribed to the Forgotten Fuse, do it now. This is exactly the kind of history we exist to tell. Before we can understand what happened to women in conquered Roman cities, we need to understand the system that produced it. Because this was not chaos. It was not the accidental breakdown of discipline. It was, in many cases, policy. The Roman army was the most professional fighting force the ancient world had ever produced. Its soldiers were not volunteers swept up in patriotic fury. They were career soldiers, men who enlisted for 20 to 25 years, trained continuously, and operated within a chain of command so precise and so enforced that individual initiative was systematically discouraged in favor of unit cohesion and obedience to orders. This same system that produced extraordinary military discipline also produced a specific understanding of what victory meant. Roman military law, and Roman law more broadly, defined the people of a conquered city as the property of the Roman state. Their lives, their freedom, their bodies belonged to Rome from the moment the city fell. What happened to them was not a crime. It was the exercise of ownership. The Roman general held the power of life and death over a conquered population. He could order a massacre. He could order enslavement. He could order the city burned to the ground or preserved intact. And crucially, he could grant his soldiers what the sources call the right of plunder, or in its most complete form, the license to do as they wished within the conquered walls. Polybius, the Greek historian who traveled with Roman armies and wrote one of the most detailed accounts of Roman military practice, described the standard procedure after a city fell. The general gave a signal, the soldiers poured in, and everything within the walls was considered legitimate prey. The practical reality of what this meant for the civilian population, particularly for women, was understood by everyone involved, including the generals who gave the orders. This is the context. Not madness, not breakdown. A system that had decided as a matter of legal and military principle that conquest erased the humanity of the conquered. In 146 BC, after 3 years of siege, the Roman army under Scipio Aemilianus broke through the walls of Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, the city that had come closer than any other to ending Roman power entirely. What followed was not simply a military victory, It was the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. The Senate had debated for years whether Carthage should be conquered or annihilated. Cato the Elder had ended every speech with the same 3 words, regardless of the subject being debated. Carthage must be destroyed. He got his wish. The sack of Carthage lasted 17 days. The ancient sources, Appian, Polybius, Livy, describe the fighting as street by street, house by house, floor by floor. Buildings were cleared from the top down, soldiers throwing the living and the dead alike from upper stories into the streets below to create passage for the advance. Appian describes the sound, the crack of breaking structures, the screams of those thrown from heights, the continuous noise of destruction moving in waves through a city of several 100,000 people. For the women of Carthage, the fall of the walls was the beginning of something the sources only partially describe. And what they do describe is precise enough. The soldiers had been fighting and dying for 3 years. The city that had cost them that time and blood was now open. Roman military practice gave them what they understood as their reward. Women who were not killed outright became slaves, a status that under Roman law placed them entirely outside legal protection. The slave had no rights over her own body. What was done to her was the business of her owner, and in the hours before formal ownership was established, in the chaos of a city being torn apart room by room, the concept of ownership had not yet crystallized into specific persons and specific property. 50,000 survivors of Carthage were enslaved. The city was burned. The ground was declared cursed. The story that Rome literally salted the earth to prevent anything from growing there again is probably a later embellishment. But it captures something real about the totality of what Rome intended. Carthage was not merely defeated, it was made to have never existed. The women who survived carried that annihilation with them into Roman households across the empire, where they would spend the remainder of their lives in a legal condition that gave their owners complete authority over everything they were. In 70 AD, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem. The siege lasted 5 months. By the end, the city's population, which had swelled with refugees and pilgrims trapped inside when the Romans closed the ring, was dying of starvation at a rate the sources describe in terms that strain credibility until you realize they are confirmed by multiple independent accounts. Josephus, the Jewish historian who had surrendered to the Romans earlier in the war and was present at the siege as an interpreter and eyewitness, left a record of what he saw that is one of the most detailed accounts of urban warfare and its aftermath in all of ancient literature. He had every reason to moderate his account. He was writing under Roman patronage, trying to present the war in terms acceptable to his Roman audience. What he recorded anyway tells you something about how extreme the reality was. When the walls finally broke, the Roman soldiers who entered the city had been fighting for 5 months outside walls that should have fallen months earlier. They had watched their comrades die of disease, of Jewish sorties, of the grinding attrition of a siege that refused to end. The city that finally opened to them was full of the starving, the dying, and the dead. Josephus describes the soldiers moving through Jerusalem with a fury that had been building for the entire length of the siege. The killing was not selective. Age did not protect. Sex did not protect. Josephus records women cut down alongside men, children alongside adults, the sick alongside those still capable of resistance. The temple, the holiest site in the Jewish world, was burned, whether by accident or intent, the sources debate, but burned nonetheless. What happened to the women who survived the initial storm is recorded in the slave market records that followed. Titus held a distribution of captives after the city fell. Those deemed useful, young, healthy, skilled, were sent to Rome for the triumph. Josephus records that 97,000 people were enslaved from the Jerusalem campaign as a whole. The women among them entered Roman slavery with everything that status meant. Josephus also records something that the official Roman accounts do not: individual cases. Women he knew, women who had been respected members of Jerusalem's community before the siege, who were now being processed like livestock through a system that had decided their city had forfeited the right to exist. The specificity of his grief is the specificity of someone who understood exactly what was happening to people he knew and could do nothing about it. The broad outlines are documented. The specific mechanics, what the experience was for individual women in individual conquered cities, require piecing together from sources that approach the subject from different angles and with different levels of directness. Roman law recognized a category called ius victoriae, the right of victory. Under this principle, everything within a conquered city belonged to the Roman state, which then delegated control to the commanding general, who could distribute it to his soldiers. Women were property under this framework, and property did not have the legal standing to refuse anything. The practical sequence typically ran as follows. When a city fell by storm, meaning the walls were taken by force rather than the city surrendering, the general had the discretion to grant his soldiers what was called the pillage. This was the period, usually lasting hours but sometimes days, during which normal military discipline was suspended and soldiers operated with near complete freedom within the conquered walls. During this period, the sources are consistent about what happened to women who could not escape or hide. Livy, writing about the sack of various Italian cities during the Second Punic War, uses formulations that his Roman audience understood completely. The soldiers helped themselves to what they found. The women of the city shared the fate of the city. These are euphemisms, but they are euphemisms for specific acts that no ancient reader would have misunderstood. After the pillage period ended and formal military order was restored, surviving women were processed into one of several categories. Those of high status might be kept for ransom, a transaction that preserved their lives while treating them as financial instruments. Those of lower status were enslaved outright and distributed among the soldiers, sold to slave traders who followed Roman armies specifically for this purpose, or transported to Rome for auction. The slave traders deserve particular attention because they represent the institutionalization of what happened. These were not opportunists appearing after the fact. They were organized businesses that operated in close coordination with the Roman military, knew the campaign schedules, positioned themselves near siege sites, and had the infrastructure to transport, process, and sell large numbers of human beings. Their presence at Roman sieges was expected, planned for, and legally accommodated. Strabo, the Greek geographer, mentions almost in passing that the slave market at Delos could process 10,000 slaves in a single day, a figure that gives you a sense of the industrial scale of what conquest produced. The women arriving at Delos from Roman campaigns were not anomalies. They were inventory. The year 146 BC saw two of the ancient world's greatest cities destroyed in the same year: Carthage in North Africa and Corinth in Greece, both eliminated within months of each other, both in ways that the sources describe with enough specificity to understand what the experience was for the people inside them. Corinth was the richest city in Greece. It controlled the isthmus connecting northern and southern Greece, which meant it controlled trade between the Aegean and Adriatic seas. Rome had been watching it with a combination of commercial envy and political suspicion for decades. The Roman consul Lucius Mummius took the city in 146 BC. Pausanias, writing 2 centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, describes what happened. The men of military age were killed. The women and children were enslaved. The city was stripped of its art, and Corinth had centuries of accumulated Greek art, some of the finest pieces in existence, and the buildings were burned. Strabo adds a detail that has haunted classicists ever since. He describes Roman soldiers playing dice on priceless Greek paintings spread out on the ground, using the masterworks of Greek art as gaming tables. The image captures something specific about the psychology of conquest, the deliberate humiliation of everything the conquered people valued. the demonstration that their treasures were nothing but surfaces for the entertainment of their conquerors. For the women of Corinth, the art on the floor was the least of it. Pausanias and Strabo between them give enough detail to reconstruct the basic sequence: the fall, the killing of men, the enslavement of women and children, the looting, the burning. The women who had woken up that morning as free citizens of one of Greece's greatest cities ended that day as property, being processed through the same system that would take them to Delos and then to households across the Roman world. Some of them may have ended up in Rome itself, in the houses of the senators who had voted for the destruction of their city. Roman history records no awareness of the irony. The historical record is not only a record of victimization, it is also, in fragments, a record of resistance. Women who found ways to refuse what was being done to them, sometimes at the cost of their lives, sometimes with outcomes that changed the political trajectory of Rome itself. The story of Lucretia sits at the founding mythology of the Roman Republic. Lucretia was a Roman noblewoman whose rape by Sextus Tarquinius, son of the last Roman king, triggered a revolt that ended the monarchy and established the Republic. The Romans told this story for centuries, not as a story about what was done to Lucretia. They told it as a story about Roman political virtue, about the founding of freedom. The uncomfortable reality that the founding of Roman freedom was inseparable from the violation of a Roman woman's body was not lost on all ancient commentators. Livy tells the story with a kind of reverent discomfort. He cannot quite make the pieces fit into a clean narrative. Lucretia's death is simultaneously the crime that justified revolution and the sacrifice that made the Republic possible. Her actual experience, what happened to her in that room, what she said to her father and husband the next morning, what drove her to the decision she made, gets considerably less attention than the political consequences. Further from Rome's founding myths, the sources record individual acts of resistance with varying degrees of sympathy. Women who killed themselves rather than submit. The Romans sometimes praised this when the women were of high status and the context was conquest by an enemy. Women who killed their attackers. These cases appear rarely and tend to be recorded with a kind of startled respect. Women who escaped. These stories almost never made it into the record at all, because escaping left no monument and no political consequence. What the resistance stories tell us collectively is that the women involved were not passive recipients of what happened to them. They made choices under conditions of extreme constraint, with the limited options available to them, in a world that had decided their choices did not legally exist. The historical record preserved some of these choices almost accidentally, in stories that were really about something else: the founding of the Republic, the character of a general, the sociology of a siege. The women themselves were incidental to the stories their experiences were used to tell, which is, in itself, a form of what was done to them. This is perhaps the most disturbing chapter. Not what happened, but what the people who ran the system thought about what was happening. Some Roman writers expressed discomfort. Livy, whose History of Rome is one of the foundational texts of Western historical writing, occasionally pauses in his narration of conquest to note that the treatment of civilians, women in particular, exceeded what was strictly necessary. He uses phrases like excessive cruelty and beyond what the laws of war permitted. But Livy's discomfort operated within a framework that never questioned the framework itself. The problem, in his telling, was excess. Soldiers who went further than the system sanctioned, generals who lost control of their men. The system itself, the ius victoriae, the legal erasure of conquered people, the slave trade that processed them, was not the problem. It was the solution that occasionally produced unfortunate excess. Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, one of the most celebrated figures in Roman history, is praised in multiple sources for his treatment of captured women. The specific praise is instructive. He is celebrated for not personally availing himself of a beautiful captive presented to him after a campaign in Spain, returning her instead to her family. Polybius tells this story as an example of exceptional Roman virtue. The exceptionalism is the point. Scipio's restraint is worth recording precisely because it was unusual. What it was unusual against, the standard behavior that his restraint departed from, goes unrecorded because it needed no explanation. Everyone knew what normally happened. Scipio was virtuous because he did not do what everyone understood was done. Caesar, in his Gallic Wars, writes about the treatment of conquered populations with the same bureaucratic detachment he applies to troop movements and supply logistics. He records massacres and enslavements with the same tone he uses to describe river crossings. The Veneti tribe, their council executed, the rest enslaved. The Aduatuci, 53,000 sold into slavery in a single transaction. These are not atrocities in Caesar's account, they are outcomes. The women are not mentioned separately because they are included in the numbers, and because their specific experiences required no special notation. The reader understood. The city has fallen. The general has returned to Rome for his triumph. The crowds cheered. The coins were minted. The monuments were carved. In the slave markets of Delos and Rome and Capua, the women of Carthage and Corinth and Jerusalem and 100 other cities were being processed through a system so efficient, so legally precise, so thoroughly normalized that the men running it did not think of themselves as doing anything wrong. They were administering victory. They were managing property. They were extending the reach of civilization. The gap between what Rome told itself it was and what it actually did, in the streets of fallen cities, in the hours between the breaking of the walls and the restoration of military order, in the slave markets that followed every campaign, is the gap this history lives in. A gap that the official record was very carefully designed to obscure. The women whose experiences this video has tried to recover did not have the option of obscuring what happened to them. They lived it, or they died in it, or they spent the rest of their lives carrying it in Roman households that would never acknowledge what it had cost to put them there. History gave them the word conquest. They deserved something closer to the truth. If this story hit you, subscribe, hit the like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. The Forgotten Fuse exists for exactly this, the history that was designed to be forgotten. We'll see you in the next one.